Greetings. Hey, thanks for joining us here on the Do Business Better podcast. It's me, your host, Damian Mason. Got a great show for you today. Got a friend of mine named Todd Thurman who's going to give us his thoughts on rhetorical appeals and how we use them in our messaging and how we use them in dealing with our customer base, or use the rhetorical appeals to convince people to do what we want them to do, or maybe even sometimes battle our detractors. He's going to explain all about rhetorical appeals. You're going to love this show because you're going to love hearing from Todd Thurman. I said he's a friend of mine. He's part of my Business of Agriculture Success Group. He is the founder and CEO of Swine Techs Consulting. That's Swine Techs, like the first part of Texas, because he's a Texas guy and he's in the swine consulting industry, helping swine industry producers be more efficient and profitable is what his business is all about. So he's a small biz guy, just like you, just like me. He's been at it for a long time. He's successful, and he's been through all the ups and the downs and the backwards and the forwards, like all of us have that run our and pilot our own ship. So Todd Thurman, welcome to the Do Business Better podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Rhetorical appeals. I love the topic. You introduced it to my Business of Ag Success Group as a potential topic. And I thought, you know what? That's something for everybody that's in business. What is the definition of rhetorical appeal?
Well, let's start with rhetoric and what is rhetoric. And the problem there is that rhetoric has gained a little bit of a bad reputation recently. So it's kind of got a negative connotation that I don't really think it deserves, but it's most often in modern context used to describe language that's sort of meaningless or insincere. It's very frequently preceded by the word empty, which is never good. And it's often describing things that politicians say. And I can't imagine anything that's more negative nowadays than being associated with things that comes out of politicians' mouth. Yeah, you hear that all the time.
Sure. When
empty rhetoric coming from politicians.
When anybody on this podcast right now says, wait a minute, we're not talking about politics, are we? No, we are not. But you'll commonly hear the word political rhetoric. And yes, as you said, rhetoric means somewhat trite, I guess is another way to call it. It's It's the same old trite, overused jargon. Yes, got it. So that's what rhetoric is, rhetorical appeal.
But what I really want to talk about is what we call classical rhetoric, and we basically call it classical rhetoric to try to distance it from the modern context of the word. And so, but what we're really saying when we talk about classical rhetoric is it's really simple. It can really be defined as the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing. So anything that you're doing communication-wise to try to persuade someone to adopt a different position, to change in one way or another, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about classical rhetoric. And so it's really not just in a political context, it's really in a wide variety of contexts. And that's really what we're talking about. And it's a really old concept. It goes way back to the ancient Greeks, and most notably Aristotle, and he's the one that wrote the book on rhetoric. In fact, he actually wrote the book Rhetoric. And it was taught in higher education and education systems around the world for thousands of years. I mean, there's evidence of rhetoric being taught in ancient Asian civilizations. It pops up in Roman civilization, certainly in Greek, but across African civilizations, it was really common. In fact, it wasn't that long ago that it would have been preposterous to think that you could consider yourself an educated person if you weren't, familiar with the rhetorical arts, right? And so, for basically most of human history, this has been a staple. And it kind of fell out of favor when we started shifting our focus to science and the scientific method. And I'm in the sciences. I'm a huge fan of science and the scientific method. But when we kind of, in our education system started focusing on research and science and scientific method, we sort of drifted away from liberal arts. And one of the side effects of that, one of the negative side effects of that, was we really quit focusing on rhetoric. But there's one place in the U.S. where in the higher education system where rhetoric is still even today commonly taught. And that's, for some reason, I'm not sure what that is, in the historically Black colleges and universities. And so if you go back particularly to the civil rights era and see some of the great rhetorical practitioners, the most notable one would obviously be Martin Luther King, but they came out of that system. And so Martin Luther King went to Morehouse College, which is a historically black college, and I believe he majored in got a Bachelor of Arts in sociology or something like that, but was undoubtedly exposed to rhetorical training at that point. And so if you want an example of how rhetoric can benefit you in your communication, there's no better example than Martin Luther King. And in fact, I think there's whole classes just based on one of his speeches and how in demonstrating how he was a master of the rhetorical arts. But that's a perfect example.
Okay, now here's the deal. All right, so rhetoric is when it's not being demonized or talked about in the media about political rhetoric, is the art of effective communication, the rhetorical arts, if you will. And somebody's listening to this right now saying, well, wait a minute, man, I'm out here. I run dry cleaners. I own fast food franchises. It's all about communication and effective communication. And what I liked about it was because you and I come from an ag background, we serve the ag industry. I commonly tell these ag people, yes, I'm going to give you some data. I'm going to tell our consumers, here's the reality about, for instance, dietary fat. It turns out that for 50 years, we've been going down the wrong road. And I can tell our consumers that. Now that's science or that's logical. Now let's also realize that doesn't necessarily work because humans are emotional. And so if you can give them the emotional appeal, like, hey, do you realize that your dad died of a heart attack largely because he probably was subscribed to bad dietary advice. He might have lived 5 to 10 years longer. Now you just reached the appeal of emotion. But you said there's a third one also, and there's the appeal to authority. So give me the scoop on that. I just talked about logic and emotion, and then the third one is authority, which I guess I never even think about because I'm so much of a anti-authority person.
Well, I think that you probably don't think about it, or maybe you think about it more than you realize. And I think you're probably an expert on it and didn't really realize it. So I'll talk about that quite a bit here in just a second. I did want to reinforce, why should you care? You asked the question, why should a guy that owns a dry cleaning, why should he care about this? Well, anybody that's trying to persuade anyone to do anything can benefit from the skills and applying these rhetorical tools. Okay. And so obviously leadership, if you're in any sort of leadership position, you're essentially persuading people to follow your vision, right? If you're in marketing, you're trying to connect with consumers and persuade consumers to accept your brand or to identify with your product or service. If you're in sales, it's probably the perfect example. Obviously, you're trying to persuade people, and it's often been said, even if you're not in sales, you're in sales, right? Whether you're a formal sales position or not, you're selling something. You're selling your ideas or your person or whatever.
That's exactly right. So that's where I'm glad you did that, because we always want to make sure we provide the benefit. What is the benefit of you continuing to listen to or view this podcast, which I should remind you, it's not just available as an audio, it's available as a video on the Damian Mason channel on YouTube, and as well as an audio wherever you pick up your podcast. But anyway, yeah, my buddy that's got a property maintenance and landscaping business. He says he probably doesn't consider himself to be a salesperson, but a call comes in and they say, I'd like you to come out and give me a bid. Well, when he's there, he needs to listen to what the customer is saying or the prospect is saying. And then he's persuade this person. If he says, okay, here's my bid for $1,000. Oh, well, someone else said it was going to be 800. Well, which thing are you going to appeal to persuade her to say, no, here's why my bid is this. So we all are in sales. And if you run your own business, obviously you've got to sell a customer base. You've got to also have, like you say, you and I both work with a lot of contractors, meaning people that help us with our business, but are not our employees. We need them to be bought into what we are doing. So yeah, there's a lot of there's no question that we are all in a persuasive role sometimes, and that's the value. So you continue.
So these three rhetorical tools, or the rhetorical appeals, are ethos, pathos, and logos. Okay, and so those are obviously Greek terms. Goes back to Aristotle. And ethos is an appeal to authority. Pathos is an appeal to emotion, and logos is an appeal to logic. Okay, so those are the three primary rhetorical tools that we have available for us. And so I'm not going to dig in real deep into these because you've got some limited time here, but I do want to touch on each one of them. And I'm going to start with ethos, which is the appeal to authority. I think this is probably the most misunderstood of the rhetorical appeals, because I think a lot of people associate it with credentialism. Right, associate it with appealing to authority, saying, so when people say, you should listen to me because I'm a doctor, or you should listen to me because I have 20 years experience doing this, or I have a PhD, or whatever it is. That's what people think of when they think of an appeal to authority. And that's certainly a component of what we're talking about here. But I think what's far more important is that you're appealing to credibility and ultimately trust. And trust's very close cousin, likability, right? And so it's exceedingly important that if you're going to appeal to authority, you have to establish that authority. And it's not authority in the sense of, I'm going to tell you what to do. It's authority in the sense of, I'm going to leverage the fact that you trust me and that you like me and that you're going to be more open to what I have to say because of the fact that you trust me and like me and sort of, identify with my general position. Okay. And so it's just like in your comedy and speaking background, you got to connect with that audience, right? You've got to identify with that audience, and you've got a pretty short amount of time in order to do that, right? That's what this is all about. It's about building that connection with your audience so that you have the credibility to move your argument forward.
Yeah. So ethos, you're saying appeal to authority, but it doesn't necessarily mean like I'm a policeman or I'm the mayor, you got to listen to me. It's more being the credible or expert authority, meaning why would I listen to Damian Mason? He wrote this book over here, Do Business Better. Well, he has been in business for himself successfully for 26 years and started from nothing. Oh, so there's the ethos appeal. Why should you listen to me? Because I've done it. Why should you listen to me? Because I'm well credentialed. Why should you listen to me? Because I'm well educated in this thing, or I have so much experience in this thing. So that's what most business people, if you think about it, Todd, that's what most of them do. Why should you listen to Todd? Because he has been consulting with swine production operations for 2 decades. Oh, am I right?
Now, that has a lot to do with it. And I think, the thing that people miss is they see that credibility part, but they miss that trust part and that connection. So you got to find that connection. And it really, I think it actually comes back to likability. People have to like you. And I think I see a lot of people giving out advice these days that says, you don't need to be liked, you just need to be respected or whatever. And I just think that's ridiculous. I think, it's really important to be likable and for people to like you, because people, they do business with people that they like. They hire people they like. They buy things from people they like. They invest in people's businesses that they like. But it doesn't mean you can't, that you need to be something that you're not. You need to be yourself. You need to be genuine, and you need to be authentic, but you need to be likable. So you need to figure out how to be a likable version of yourself. And a lot of people like a lot of different types of people too. So that's it's what makes the world go round. But I do think it's extremely important to be likable, and so that you can establish that trust and credibility, so that you can again move your argument forward. And really, to take just a short step back, what we're trying to do here when we're trying to persuade someone, we're trying to open their mind. Okay, so make them more malleable to change. And then the second step there is we're going to try to change their mind. And then the last step is we're going to try to get them to do something different, right? They're going to have to actually make the change, right? And so that's a step that a lot of people forget, but you can't skip that first step, which is opening their mind. And that's really what ethos is all about. It's about establishing that, trust and relationship with those people, so that you can soften them up and give them and create that environment where they're more likely to consider your persuasive language or your persuasive writing or whatever it is. One thing I would like to add too there is that you can borrow credibility, you can borrow authority, but you need to be really careful about that. Okay, so if I'm going into a new audience and I'm speaking to this audience and I happen to know that audience are big fans of Damian Mason, right? I can sort of borrow a little bit of that credibility. Maybe I use a Damian Mason quote early in my discussion, or maybe I say, "Hey, I'm friends with Damian Mason. We were having this conversation," and so you can borrow some credibility there. I think you need to be really careful with that and judicious in that, but you can certainly do that. You see a lot of that, and that's certainly okay to do. You just got to be a little bit careful, because at the end of the day, if you lean too much on that, you could basically just be strengthening. I could end up be strengthening your relationship with my audience, and not really necessarily transferring that relationship to me and my connection with the audience.
Yeah, right. And I'm thinking about the small business person that, that listens to this podcast is probably saying, well, when would that matter to me? Well, you show up and they maybe question your authority. I know that I've done this, and I don't do it in a abrasive way, but there's times when you just want to know someone's credentials. So you said, hey, this all seems fine, but just give me a little bit of background. And yeah, I think that then sometimes you'll hear them say, well, I worked with so-and-so. And that's where that like you said, not only it gives you credibility to say, well, that's why a lot of times people use references. It's not necessarily references for why people think it, like you said, it maybe is, I worked with so-and-so. Oh, now I just got credibility and some authority. Emotion. Humans like their emotions. It's all about the feels, not the reals. So that's the pathos. Give it to me.
Yep. So pathos is an appeal to emotion, and the goal there is to elicit an advantageous emotional response from your audience. Okay. Now that can be a lot of different things. Okay. There's a lot of different emotions that can be useful in persuading people. Excitement is one that can be useful. Happiness, anger, pride, fear. Fear is a really strong one. Obviously, you wrote the book Food Fear, and that's a perfect example. And that's a really common one that politicians in particular like to appeal to. But let me give you an example of a positive emotion in a way that somebody used it on me, right? So many years ago, I was working for a big multinational company, and my supervisor, who was a really good leader, he came to me with an opportunity to move my family to Russia, for 2 years. And so he sits down, and it sort of caught me off guard a little bit, because he was really emphasizing the money. The money was good. Not only is the money good, but you can save some money because the company will pay for, a lot of your expenses while you're living overseas. And obviously that's a tough sell, to, move your family from the U.S. to Russia for a couple of years. But he kept emphasizing that. And I realized, looking back on it later, I realized he was really appealing to my desire to provide for my family. Right. He knew I was a young guy with a young family. I had a 6-year-old daughter at the time. Yep. And that, every young guy at that age, early in their career, wants to provide for their family. And so he was, appealing to that. And we had a lot of discussions about a lot of different things, but that's an example of how you appealed to a positive emotion there, that it wasn't so much about the money. It was really about, what could you do with the money? You could really set yourself up to be able to, do a really good job taking care of your family. So that's a perfect example of how you can utilize that to sort of influence people. And I obviously knew I was being influenced at the time, but I didn't really realize exactly how until I looked back on it later.
Yeah, it's interesting. You've been around the block a few times. You realize that people are trying to persuade you to do something, and then you're wondering now which thing are they working on. Emotional appeal is, it seems to me, the most effective, because humans are very emotional. But let's make sure we get through it. So we got the appeal to authority, we got the appeal to emotion, and now let's go with logos.
Okay, one more thing on pathos first, and you got to be a little bit careful here, because people don't mind being persuaded, but they don't like being manipulated. And your biggest risk, if you're employing pathos, if you're employing those emotions, that's the biggest risk of people feeling like they're being manipulated. Okay. And so you just got to be really careful and make sure you don't overdo it. And you also probably want to tend towards appealing to positive emotions. There are times when appealing to negative emotions can be very, very effective, but you want to be careful about that. And I think you just want to have my advice is to have a general tendency, general preference towards appealing to more positive emotions. And you can kind of get away from that manipulation. It's also a perfect opportunity to mention that all these are related to one another, right? And if you've got really good ethos, if you've established a really good trustful relationship, you can afford to be more aggressive with your emotional appeals, right? Because you know your audience better. They trust you. If you do overstep your bounds a little bit, they're going to forgive you a lot easier and quicker than they would if you didn't have that relationship. So, it's a good thing to keep in mind. So moving on to logos. Logos is the one that a lot of us feel the most comfortable with. This is what we prefer. This is our preferred method of communication. It's, a perfect example is it's the one that scientists and experts of all flavors prefer, and it's the way they communicate with each other, right? Okay, so this is how experts communicate amongst themselves. And so the environment there is at least supposed to be emotion-free, right? When two experts or two scientists, they're supposed to be, it's all about the facts, all I care about is the evidence. That's not 100% true, but they certainly operate in this environment that at least makes them feel like that emotions are not an issue. And then the authority issue is mostly your peers, right? And so you sort of have established authority, have established a credibility in those types of groups. And so, that's where you see that communication. So if you go to a scientific forum and you see, scientists presenting their data, this is the kind of communication that's going to happen. Aristotle argues that logos is the least effective of the three appeals, right? And I can imagine that must have been an extremely hard admission for him to make. I mean, he's considered the father of logic, for crying out loud, right? He literally wrote the book on logic. And so, that must have been a tough appeal to him. And because he's so associated with logic, when he says that ought to raise your eyebrows. Well, that's interesting. He actually thought that ethos was the most effective, and that pathos was right behind it, and that logos was the least effective. And so I think as we start looking at examples where it can be effective is maybe an easy way to explain it. I've already talked about one. Experts communicating with one another, logos can be very effective because we've had this shared, respect and authority because we're peers and we're trying to stay away from the emotions, and everybody sort of agrees on that. Another one that it can be very effective in is with, we call it in politics, pumping up your base, right? It's people that already pretty much agree with you, right? It can be really effective if you're trying to make an appeal to people that kind of generally agree with you. So if they agree with your general approach to life, if you and I know each other, and I think, there's a lot of things about the way you think that I agree with, maybe you're trying to make a new appeal and you're trying to convince me of something different. These are people that essentially want to be convinced. If you can provide them with some facts that help them rationalize their own tendencies towards wanting to agree with you anyway, it can be super effective. One area where it's not effective at all is when you have experts communicating to non-experts. And if you think about it, when we talk about sales and particularly marketing, that is really common. That's a common situation where you have people that really know their product and all the technical aspects of the product at a very deep level, trying to sell it to somebody that doesn't have that technical expertise. And so you need to be really careful. Those are the areas where you should lean heavily on one of the other two appeals and use the logical appeals to sort of bolster it. Okay. And so I think the mistake that we make a lot of times is we lead with logos, and we really should lead with one or both of the others and then back that up with logos. So those logical appeals can be very helpful to kind of be supporting evidence to our claim, but not the main reason that we expect you to change your mind.
So if you want to convince people to change their minds, emotion and appeals to authority are more effective. You said that and we prepared our notes. And I'm thinking through, and I'm thinking, of course, the person that's listening to this, it's like, okay, I run a dry cleaner. I have fast food restaurants. I have a landscaping business, whatever it is. They're saying, well, what am I doing with all this? Well, I think that what you're talking about is you have to meet with clients because none of us can work without having someone give us money, right? That's what our business is. You work for people's money. I work for people's money. We all work for other people's money. I remember distinctly with my beef business for 13 years, I sold freezer beef to people. And I remember a woman that's not a farm person said, hey, so-and-so told me I should buy beef off you. I've never done this. What's the deal? And I went right into the product and I talked about the pricing per pound, all that. that woman didn't give two hoots now about all that stuff. She'd already been told by a person she trusted. Again, there was that authority. I didn't need to bolster my authority to tell her I knew more about beef than her. She got told from one of her peers that she trusted that Damian Mason was the trusted place to get a quarter of beef from. And stupidly looking back at it, I'm like, Grant didn't change my life. It's a quarter of beef. But the reality is I should have simply said, yeah, you want some beef for your family? You want some good quality beef for your family? There's the emotional part of it. Yeah, I've got what you need. and that's it. Instead, I went down the whole thing of making sure she knew that I was an authority, and logically went through the whole thing about, it depends on the frame size. It could be $520 for this quarter. It could be $590 because it's going to be to frame your animal. She didn't know anybody of that. I said, you want some beef? You want some good quality beef for your family? Yeah, it'll be about $500. That's all I needed to do and I look back at that, and granted, they did become customers, but I remember thinking, now I'm looking back like, yeah, we overdo that, Todd. And that's what you were just saying. You know more about the pig industry than 99% of the population, 99.9% of the population. But sometimes people don't need to know that. If they're just at the cocktail party and it's somebody that might want to do business with you, they maybe don't need to know all that. So I'm just thinking through these real life situations that all of us are in as small biz people, that we maybe over logic it, or we want to make sure they know our credentials.
Yeah, very, very few people care about the technical aspects of what they buy, right? And some do, and you need to be cognizant of that. And when people are expecting a logos argument, you need to be prepared with a logos argument, right? Because they're going to be very disappointed if you try to appeal to their emotions when they're expecting to be convinced based on data, right? So always have those logos arguments in your back pocket in case you get blindsided. But if you work under the assumption that a ethos or pathos approach is going to be more effective, you're going to be right majority of the time. My daughter has a little side business, a little side hustle where she does custom floral design for people, and I'm constantly telling her, you're not selling floral designs. You're not selling bouquets. You're not selling arrangements. You're selling emotions, right? You're selling specifically the emotions that your customers are trying to elicit in other people, right? And so you need to be focused on, they don't care which flowers, ask them what colors they like. Ask them what kind of mood you want to create. Is this a celebration? Is this maybe somebody's, lost their grandmother and you can help them. You can do that. You know how that works. I don't know how that works. They don't know how that works, but you know how that works. And so you can help them get the emotional reaction that they're hoping to get from whoever they're buying these flowers for, whether that's for somebody else or even for themselves. And so I'm always constantly encouraging her to think about that. You care about the technical stuff. You should care about the technical stuff. Because you need to be able to create an arrangement that does what you said it's going to do, but they don't care.
No. Yeah, that's fantastic. And we see this all the time. I've been in sales and as a self-employed small biz person, like you said, we all sell. And the better you get about understanding what matters to them, because as I always say, sales is very simply understanding a person's problem and positioning yourself as the solution. So do you do that by telling them the logical way that you're going to repair their plumbing? You do that by saying, oh, I can see where you're upset. You haven't been able to take a shower for 3 days. I can repair your plumbing. More importantly, I can make it so you can have a shower. There's the emotional versus the, let me tell you why you got a problem, with your 3/4 inch PVC pipe, blah, blah, blah. And I see the credibility. I think that sometimes you talked about if you were at a convention of scientists, they'd all be doing logical stuff. Don't kid yourself. They also, if they're up there to persuade one another, people that are well-educated can't stop talking about how well-educated they are oftentimes. So that's that whole thing of, I'm going to tell you about my credentials. You ever hear the introduction for a professor? I'm at this speaking engagement. My introduction is Damian Mason's agricultural guy. Watch this. and they are magna cum laude, professor emeritus, graduate with distinction, taught such and such, degrees in this. And I'm like, get over yourself. All right, you got a PhD. Anyway, go ahead then. What does the person listening to this need to know then? First off, understand what your customer or prospect wants. Sometimes they want a logical appeal. Sometimes they want a emotional. I would argue that they generally want some emotion in there or the authority. Understand that. What's the other takeaway?
Yeah, so I think that's the big one. I think you just want to lead. You want to kind of your default setting should be leading with either the ethos or the pathos, and kind of save the logos for a supporting evidence. And I think the other one is to understand those moments where logos is most appropriate, because that's a big opportunity that could be a missed opportunity if you go too far the other way. So always be prepared to have that discussion. And nobody expects you to, if you're a salesperson, a technical salesperson, nobody expects you to be able to have a really, really deep discussion about whatever the product is with an expert in the field, but they do expect you to be able to have a competent conversation and a facts-based conversation. So be prepared for that when you're in one of those environments where that's appropriate. And then I think that the last thing is there's some very good superficial learnings to be had from just having this discussion and kind of understanding the real basics of these three appeals, but there is a ton of meat on that bone. Digging a little bit deeper into that, I've been studying that for close to 2 years now, and I find it fascinating. It's almost like a layer of onions that you just keep peeling back another layer, and you find another little nugget of insight. And so there's a lot of resources out there for you to study rhetoric and rhetorical appeals at a deeper level, and there's just a lot of different angles. And so I would encourage everybody. There's a lot of material online, free material online. There's a lot of good books out there. Dig into it. I think it's be well worth your time, and it's super practical. It's really applicable. It's things you can use tomorrow, and so that's what I really like about it. I think it's really useful in a broad context, and it's not something that you have to understand at a really deep level to be able to take advantage of.
I like it, and I agree with you, because what we're really talking about is, obviously, we're talking about connecting with the people. And there's folks that right now are listening saying, well, I got this business. I don't really care about, I don't need to persuade anybody. No, that's not true at all. Take it from Todd, who's been running his own business for a long time. Or in China, he works in China, he works in Russia. He can't even speak their language very well, but he knows he has to make sure to persuade them to do what his business is in the business of doing, which is helping the other company's business. He needs to persuade people. We all persuade people to ultimately make a living and become our customers. Todd Thurman said something interesting at the beginning, and we never got to it. You said, you're an expert. I think you were talking about me, and probably don't even realize you do this. So wait a minute. I want to be told how brilliant I am. What am I an expert at?
Well, you're a speaker, and connecting with your audience and understanding your audience is really what Ethos is all about. It's about establishing that trust. It's about establishing that credibility. And so when you come out on the stage to do comedy, you have a pretty short period of time where people are going to make a judgment call whether they like you or not. And if they like you early on in that set, right, then they're going to forgive your mistakes later, or they're going to forgive your flubs, or if you're not that funny. If they like you initially, and if you establish that rapport really quickly, they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And if they don't, then they're going to be super hard on you. Same way, I'm sure, when you're speaking, you got to make that connection fairly early on with your audience, and that's really what it's about. I think people get so caught up in this. This is why you should believe me, because I know all these things, or I've done all these things. That's not what people really respond to. That can give you a good start, right? That big list of educational degrees and everything you've got that people like to share when they're talking with other experts. Nobody really cares about that stuff, right? What they really care about is, can I trust you? Do I like you, and can I trust you? And that's really what you've got to establish.
Todd, that's interesting, because, and it's, again, everybody listening to this, they're not in the business of getting on stage or being a swine consultant, but it doesn't matter. It's the same stuff. I used to think, man, I'm at this conference and everybody here has an advanced degree, but me. And then I used to wonder, is that going to be all right? Well, first off, the audience doesn't necessarily only care about that. And as you said, I had a rule a long time ago, back when I was in political comedy: first, be funny. Meaning, the old thing about geometry, you do your proofs, or you go through and and I always said, first, be funny. Funny fixes a lot of stuff. First off, I was in the comedy business. So by God, if you're not funny, you got a problem. So I always said, first be funny. What about this? I'm like, first be funny. And so there is something to that. And it does create a bit of goodwill, as you said, and it creates a little bit of forgiveness. At the 15-minute mark, then if you use a cuss word, by then they either decide they liked you or they didn't like you. So first be funny. I agree with that. Ethos, pathos, logos. appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, appeal to logic, how you can use it in your business. I think it's awesome. Todd Thurman, what's your last closing thought, closing note, something you can share with everybody that they can apply to their business or life?
I think as we start thinking about this, the more often you think about situations in which you were effectively persuaded, I think it gives you a really nice perspective. Okay, it could give you an idea, and that could be positive or negative. I think the thing I'd like to kind of part with here is these tools can be equally applied for evil and for good, right? The art of rhetoric is only the success of your rhetoric is only determined by whether or not you succeed in persuading someone. Okay, so there are positive, good reasons why you can try to persuade someone, and there are bad reasons why you can try to persuade someone. You can try to persuade someone to buy your product. It's a great product. You can also persuade someone to jump off a bridge or to try heroin, right? There's a lot of different things you can do there. And so, I think if you think about it from the perspective of your audience, and draw on your experience as the person that's being persuaded, I think it can give you a really interesting take on things. And so we tend to think of examples of when we've persuaded other people successfully, right. And that's certainly fine. But I think there's a lot to be learned from times that you were persuaded successfully, and really understanding, like the example that I gave of my supervisor appealing to an emotion that was important to me, even though I didn't fully realize it at the time. Lots to be learned there.
Yeah, that's a dead on, is that it's real helpful to think back as you get older and better at what we do, thinking back about what has worked with us. And, it doesn't take long for somebody to realize that one of the things I value greatly is my independence. That's why I started my own business when I was 25, whatever. So a person that wanted to appeal to me or persuade me would, of course, say, hey, I'd like you to do this thing, but remember, it's on your terms. And I've had that before. I've got someone that wants to do business with me. They make sure they push hard that it's on your terms. And as you said, I think the real important thing is you can make yourself a stronger business person. And also when you analyze these three rhetorical appeals, it can be good for good or evil. Jim Jones and Charles Manson were extremely persuasive individuals. And you say, oh, well, they just got a bunch of crazy people to follow them. Well, they got people to follow them, right or wrong. So they were persuasive. And then also some great successful people. Elon Musk is very persuasive. He just, this headline today, he's now become the world's richest person. So, all right. His name's Todd Thurman, friend of show. Glad he came by. It's happy hour where he is. So we're going to let him shove off now. If they want to find you to look you up for any reason, where do they find Todd Thurman?
Probably the easiest way is to go to the website. That's swinetex.com, SWINETEX.com. And from there, you can find contact information, links to all the socials and all that stuff. That's probably the easiest way to.
And I do encourage you to keep up with Todd on LinkedIn. He has some really good stuff. It's usually from a food and agricultural perspective, but also from a business perspective, because he's a small biz guy just like you and just like me. So check out his LinkedIn profile. It's the best stuff. He puts really good stuff out there. All right. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks a lot for having me.
All right. Till next time, it's the Do Business Better podcast.